45 franchises have played in at least one official NBA season. 45. Naturally, a handful of that number have been extraordinary. The Spurs, Celtics, and Lakers alone have won over half the league's championships. Their stories have been told, though. Their legends litter the annals of basketball history. Their banners stand as testament to the great men and women who built them from the ground up. Everyone wants to talk about the best. Nobody ever ventures to the other end of extraordinary, explores the basement dwellers and bottom feeders, tells the stories of the men who did it for the love of the game and to no acclaim. They too deserve to be heard. Even the worst of the worst. Even the game's least successful franchise to ever disgrace an NBA basketball court. Even the original Denver Nuggets. Decades before the NBA and so too the Nuggets were even ideas, the people of Colorado were laying the groundwork for a passionate love affair with the game of basketball. Against all the odds, seemingly, a game invented in Massachusetts and first officially played in New York, basketball's cultural epicenter was far, far away from the soaring heights of the Rockies. So thoroughly isolated was the state dotted with little more than obscure mining towns that they should have had no connection to the urbane sport that was basketball. Sometimes the universe has other plans, though. Sometimes destiny intervenes and tips the delicate scales of fate in your favor. Purely by chance, James Naismith, the inventor of the game himself, decided to pull up stakes and leave Massachusetts in 1895 to attend Gross Medical College in far-off Denver. It was an inexplicable stroke of luck. There were hundreds of cities that had both a YMCA and a medical school where he could have pursued his passions and his education, including 3 within 100 miles of his previous post in Springfield. Naismith opted for the rugged West anyway. His 3 years in Colorado were wildly influential on the development of basketball in the state. What was once seen as a mere pastime favored by young women became a serious competitive endeavor. Within just 1 year of his arrival in Denver, the YMCA began awarding a state championship in basketball, and high school interscholastic play began. Though they may seem insignificant milestones, they made Colorado trailblazers. In fact, the first Colorado YMCA championship was so before its time that it took place months prior to the official basketball rules limiting teams to 5 players. Contextually, it was unheard of, and the game's movers and shakers took notice. In 1898, greener pastures called on Naismith. Lacking official responsibility in the game and freshly presented with his medical degree, Naismith, truthfully, was ready to move on. Recommended by legendary football coach Amos Alonzo Stagg, for whom he had played at Springfield, Naismith was offered the PE post at the University of Kansas, in turn embarking on a rather unsuccessful collegiate coaching career before turning away from the sport, much preferring the rewards of his teaching and preaching careers. His old pupils did not turn their backs on the game, though. No, instead the seeds Naismith planted blossomed into an awe-inspiring round ball renaissance in his absence. One that spread from county to county, town to town, and turned Colorado into something nearer Indiana than the basketball backwater it should have been. By 1901, the fervor had grown so strong that the University of Colorado and Colorado State fielded their first varsity basketball squads. After Indiana, it was only the second state to sponsor basketball at more than one of its flagship institutions, before even North Carolina, whose 2 major schools wouldn't do so for another decade. And it didn't stop there. Inspired by the competitive spirit instilled in their youths and the state's significant amateur sports scene, Colorado's major universities decided to award the first ever collegiate basketball championship of Colorado. Though schedules were supplemented with games against barnstormers, high schoolers, and amateurs, this loose proto-conference was the first of its kind among the western states. Thanks in part to that foresight, the students duked it out to outsized fanfare from the local media, whose praise was especially effusive for the ore diggers from Mines, who won no less than a share of every single championship of Colorado. Adding Utah and Wyoming to its existing lineup, their proto-conference became the Rocky Mountain Conference, only the fourth official league in all of major college basketball. A pair of Romneys, practically Mormon royalty, headlined its first championship team at Utah, who along with CU dominated the early days of the league. The Utes formed into such a power that they even went on to win the league's first national championship in 1916. Naismith's disciples did not feel that they had been beaten to the punch, however. They had successfully spread the joys of their game all across the Mountain West. In the end, that was the goal. Perhaps they had been overtaken on the court, but that could not overshadow the state's strides within the game. Nor would it in the future. See, decades of schools, churches, and universities nurturing dependencies to competitive basketball had created yet another mechanism by which the game could grow in the Centennial State: men's leagues. Despite lacking the infrastructure or population density to compete with the burgeoning professional game of the East, there was still a significant underlying demand for top-level basketball in Colorado, one that was crying out to be met. And so it was. Akin to soccer's early days in England, employers, trade unions, even military units fielded teams to compete in a broad spectrum of basketball competitions. The National Guard had a state league, Denver had a city league, and Southern Colorado had a unique regional league owing to its relative isolation, all of which were intensely meaningful as a matter of bragging rights. Make no mistake, though, these leagues did not hold up to the newly minted American Basketball League. Financed by rising entrepreneurs and pro sports kingpins, the ABL was truly a first-of-its-kind pro basketball league. Its players were bona fide contracted professionals, its teams were given familiar names, and its arenas far, far exceeded the municipal offerings out west. Cleveland reportedly drew 10,000 spectators for the inaugural championship game in 1926, a figure that was nearly half of Colorado's largest football stadium. It was seemingly destined to be what the NBA is today. Was. As the days of the Roaring Twenties waned, a perfect confluence of events saved the Mile High men from permanent insignificance. Black Tuesday most prominently hammered the fortunes of the ABL's benefactors, picking teams off one by one until the league, and thereby major professional basketball, folded in 1931. Compounding their misery, basketball as a whole was seeing an unprecedented power shift west. Legendary coaches like Phog Allen and players like Cat Thompson began to show their teeth all across the Western scene. Thompson's Montana State won an improbable college basketball title in '29. Teams from Kansas or Kansas City won 9 out of 10 amateur titles after they moved the tournament there in '21. The University of Northern Colorado even made their own run at immortality, advancing to the AAU second round in '31. Maybe they couldn't afford pro ball, but at the amateur level, Western ball had never been stronger, and it was hitting its stride at just the right time. Since 1928, the game had been governed globally by the International Amateur Handball Federation, who threw their support unsuccessfully behind handball instead of basketball to make the cut at the 1932 LA Olympics. Basketball's movers and shakers were determined to rectify that error in time for Berlin '36, no matter the cost. Geneva YMCA director Elmer Barry and Swiss Basketball Federation founder Léon Bouffard brought 8 nations together to form an independent governing body, intending to pursue IOC recognition behind the IAHF's back. This move would dramatically change the calculus of professional basketball. The Olympics were an exclusively amateur event as late as the 1980s, which meant that no players who signed professional basketball contracts would be able to play for the world's highest sporting honor. Even the slightest chance that it might happen spurred a new wave of interest in AAU basketball. Texas, California, Colorado, and Oklahoma all saw huge increases in hardwood ambition, with the potential Olympic berth now looming as a tangible reward for those efforts. So consequential was the boom that some of America's most influential basketball teams, like the Phillips 66ers, came to prominence in its wake. One such team was even assembled because of the boom, to give chase to dreams that only the boldest men dared to dream. to again change basketball in Colorado forever. Likely formed in the winter of 1930, the Denver Piggly Wiggly Pigs had been a strong force in local basketball since their inception. Despite spending months on the road as barnstormers, they managed to reach the Denver City Finals in 31 and win the city and regional titles in 32 before unceremoniously bowing out of AAU Nationals in their very first game. But their dreams were bigger. They wanted to send Denver, Colorado, Western basketball to Berlin. They wanted to be immortal. So they tore it all down and started over. From top to bottom, wholesale changes were made to the speciously amateur outfit. They made an attempt to abandon barnstorming, filing for membership in the Missouri Valley, the AAU's premier regional league. Coach Harry Miller was ousted in favor of Glenn Jacobs, then head coach at New Mexico Normal and former four-sport standout at Northern Colorado. The star of the show, though, was the roster overhaul. Jacobs and general manager Bill Haraway recruited 8 new players to the Pigs. 3, the former Northwest Missouri State All-American trio of Jumpin' Jack McCracken, Duck Dowell, and Tom Merrick were widely considered to be some of the best players in the whole country, prompting local media to declare the team national championship favorites. Initially, they struggled with the weight of those expectations. Though they handled college and amateur teams alike, the 1933 team failed to win a game at the AAU Nationals for a second year running, turning instead to the YMCA equivalent for glory. Their woes were compounded further when, just after the season ended, Percy Merrick, the brother of Pig star Tom Merrick, murdered key role player Henry Downs after a perceived affront against his wife. Jacobs and Haraway stood firm through it all. They doubled down, bringing in 4 new men to bolster their ambitions. The hope was that the headline additions of Pittsburgh State stars Ernie Schmidt and Francis Wachter would overshadow the loss of Downs and finally put the counterjumpers over the top, but they too came up short. While the team did get back to the AAU tournament, they meekly bowed out in a quarterfinal bout with one-time champions Olympic Club. Over the next 2 years, the Pigs, now sponsored by Safeway, largely stagnated at that level, falling in the quarterfinals in 35 and 36, bringing their Olympic dreams to a sputtering end. Well, kinda. While their chances of playing their way in through the AAU were over, the Denver YMCA sought to send the Pigs as their representatives to the YMCA National Tournament in Kansas, the winner of which would also play in the Olympic qualifiers. It was a much-needed chance for the team, whose coach Glenn Jacobs had just resigned in shame, to reset. They had triumphantly represented the city in the same tournament just 3 years earlier and were runaway favorites to bring home top honors again. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a light at the end of the tunnel. Powered by late-game heroics from the much-maligned Merrick, at last the Pigs lived up to the billing. With no time to waste, the triumphant squad boarded a train for New York, where they were set to face the collegiate champions from Utah State in a first-round Rocky Mountain showpiece. Bookmakers even had them as 8-point favorites in an era where games routinely ended in the 30s. That little light at the end of the tunnel was growing ever brighter. Then, out of nowhere, things again went awry. YMCA leadership, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the Pigs had violated an esoteric rule by entering the AAU and YMCA tournaments under different banners in such a short period of time. Supporters of the Denver outfit noted that this same rule had also allegedly been violated in their 1933 championship campaign, yet they were still awarded the trophy. They had even sent a telegram to the YMCA national office before the tournament clearing the Pigs' participation, to no pushback. Contemporaries even thought the ruling to be ludicrous, that it was as clear a case of corruption as you'd ever see. YMCA basketball chairman G.M. Good, a Western Pennsylvania boy, had ruled out the far-off Denver squad, gifting an Olympic playoff spot to Will Merding, a Western Pennsylvania team. He could have at least made it a little less obvious. Dreams dashed a second time, the Pigs found themselves in a tenuous situation. They had seen high highs, but now they had 5 fewer players, no coach, and a sponsor with less commitment to the project. They couldn't walk away, though. Not now. Not with all the overwhelming systemic advantages they had accrued over the last decade. The AAU championships were being played in Denver every year. Much of the nation's best college basketball was played in their footprint, and they were playing in the all-powerful Missouri Valley, the greatest amateur league in the world. Instead, as they had always done, they doubled down. To appease their star player Jack McCracken, the team brought in Missouri high school coach Everett Shelton, who was a well-liked assistant at Northwest Missouri State while he, Dowell, and Merrick all competed for the Bearcats. Shelton drastically deviated from how Glenn Jacobs had run the Pigs. In the mold of Michigan's Cappy Cap'n, Shelton wanted a tight rotation of players who had the stamina to run the whole game. To that end, he only brought in 4 players to replace 5 and let YMCA hero Tom Merrick walk to in-state rivals Colorado Springs, despite everything he'd given to Denver. He was an optimizer, and no matter the lengths he had to go to, he was going to get the optimal outcome out of his team. Relative to years past, they floundered through the season. They were still among the best teams in the Missouri Valley, but convincingly lost games against far inferior opponents like Merrick's Antlers that they just hadn't before. The season was not what Shelton was building for, though. He had the vision to see that the Pigs' biggest problem was always in the tournament, and so spent the entire season physically and mentally conditioning them to play 5 games in 6 days at the national championships. Rather than sauntering through the tournament and losing their first rock fight like usual, the Pigs turned every game into a rock fight, because that was their biggest strength. As it turned out, that was all they needed to do all along. Powered by their All-American trio of McCracken, Grunig, and Colvin, the Denver Safeway Stores Pigs ascended the AAU mountain at last. They weren't going to rest on their laurels, however. 1940 was now in sight, the Olympics again an attainable dream, and it was going to take even more determination to stay atop the mountain than it took to ascend. Unfortunately, it looked as if their iron wills had quickly turned to dust. After reclaiming the Missouri Valley title, heartbreak again found its fondest victim when Fred Prowl of the Kansas City Heelys dropped a last-second layup to steal the national title in front of 7,000 stunned Denverites. They didn't know if they'd get a shot at redemption either. Owing in part to a new tax on grocers in Colorado, Safeway finally walked away from the team, calling into question their continuing viability for the 3rd time in 5 years. It sounds trivial now. After all, why couldn't the team just find a new sponsor? But the whole team was employed by Safeway, and now they would have to choose their jobs or their team. Coach Shelton chose his job, leaving the team's fate in the hands of Captain Jack McCracken. Try as he might, there was no chance McCracken was going to be able to field a team. Though local media reported that a handful of companies were interested in sponsoring the Pigs, as the months wore on, no offers materialized. In a last-ditch effort, former GM Bill Haraway, unwilling to see the team he built from scratch lost to history, pitched a revolutionary idea. Ask the city to sponsor it. Nearly 10,000 people came to see their big games. Their fame carried the city's name all over the country, and their success had contributed to bringing the AAU tournament to Denver. Why not treat it as a valuable municipal tourism driver? The city was so enamored by Haraway's proposal that they immediately signed on. From the brink, they brought back a club renewed, with a new motivation, a new home, and a new name: the Denver Nuggets. Playing in the familiar Denver auditorium, the Nuggets' 2 superstars really found their grooves. The indomitable Grunig led the Missouri Valley in scoring, while McCracken was widely honored as its best player en route to yet another league title. Then to another national title. The AAU even went so far as to name McCracken the greatest basketball player of all time after the tournament. That momentum carried into the next season, resulting in a runner-up finish to the resurgent 66ers in both the league and nationally. The Nuggets machine was just as ruthless as it had been under Coach Shelton, it seemed, but their constant stream of good fortune did eventually come to an end. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 was nearly cataclysmic for the Nuggets and the sport. The Olympics, which were for many the entire motivation behind playing amateur basketball, were shelved indefinitely. Further, several of the best amateur teams, the Nuggets' biggest competitors, were scaled back. Many of them were fielded by oil companies and manufacturers deemed critical to the war effort, meaning that their players, who were in practice employees of the companies, had to be diverted to more impactful roles within them. It was all hands on deck. That mentality permeated the nation as a whole. In September of 1940, President Roosevelt signed the Selective Service Act, instituting America's first ever peacetime draft for all men between 21 and 35, roughly the same age as a basketball team. The dream was gone, the schedule was gone, the players' availability was tenuous at best, and all the uncertainty led to Denver withdrawing their sponsorship of the team. Where do you go from there? Local leaders presented a proposal that would at least keep the team alive until the Missouri Valley came back by organizing as barnstormers under the banner of the American Legion. In truth, the situation was so dire that McCracken had no choice but to accept. Forget the sponsorship. He needed the community's continuing support to keep his players employed. He owed them that. That season was a lost cause on the hardwood. Because they couldn't play opponents of the requisite standard with any regularity, McCracken's men fell in tournament play to an SMU squad that went just 10-10 in their collegiate season. No matter, at the end of the day, they still had a team, and most around Denver were happy to revel in that miracle. Against all the odds, the team had managed to retain its nucleus. McCracken, Grunig, and Wyoming legend Pete Lutie all avoided the draft and remained healthy, even at their relatively advanced ages. They did have to fill some of the roster through open tryouts and a little digging, but they hoped their digging had unearthed diamonds. That probably undersells it a little. They needed to have unearthed diamonds. By the beginning of the Missouri Valley season, rumors had emerged that Denver legends McCracken and Grunig were likely to be going on something of a farewell tour. They needed, then, for their recruitment to be right, for their role players to go out and earn it every night, to send their legends off the right way. And they did. The team was still dominated by its stars, but Jack Gray and former DU standout Harold Peterson gave them exactly what they were missing. The more balanced Denver Five walked all the way back to the national title game, losing only twice all season, and emphatically thumped the 66ers to bring home another trophy. That seemed a beautiful swan song for Denver basketball. The hometown heroes got to parade the sport's highest annual honor one last time before the lights turned off for good. That summer, McCracken signed to be player coach of the 66ers. Lutie signed to be head coach at Regis College, and the roster scattered in the wind. Of the entire operation, only Ace Grunig remained in Denver. He had a wife, kids, and a union job. He couldn't walk away from all that for a game. He tried to rally Denver basketball back in some form, but when the season rolled around in December of '42, he had nothing. Unbelievably, it was over. The Denver area nearly gave up the sport altogether. CU didn't field a team at all, despite going to the Final Four in '42. DU withdrew from the Skyline Conference, and all the while, the newspapers barely covered the sport, save for a passing mention of the exploits of Jumpin' Jack. Only when it was announced that the AAU tournament was coming back to Denver did anyone even consider the possibility of getting a team together to qualify. It wouldn't cost anyone much money after all, so long as they used local players, and they had, at the time, the greatest scoring big man to ever play the game working an industrial job down the street, desperate for one more run. Around Grunig, they were able to put together what was, in theory, a competitive team. Much of the best amateur talent had answered their nation's call in the wake of Pearl Harbor, voluntarily or otherwise, the season before. Thus, patchwork teams were the norm anyway. With so many premier college programs in their footprint, it wasn't entirely inconceivable that they, as much as anyone else, could find a winning combination. Denver faced a tough challenge from the eventual NCAA champion Wyoming Cowboys, but they did indeed find a successful-ish team. Relying heavily on the All-American twin towers of Grunig and Bob Dole out of CU, the squad made it all the way to the national championship game, where in a cruel twist of fate, they met McCracken's 66ers. The 66ers steamrolled them. In Denver's absence, they had taken a monopoly on the Missouri Valley and AAU basketball at large, and the gulf in quality was apparent. The miracle run to the final, however, galvanized Denver's basketball community. Local fruit magnate Jay Ambrose, head over heels in love with the game, took it upon himself to financially back the team. With his support, many of Denver's best players flocked back to the Mile High City. Ambrose and McCracken even managed to lure 2 additional All-American stars from the local military installations to join their ranks. They never got the magic back, though. League structures changed. The Missouri Valley gave way to the American Basketball League, containing all the best amateur teams around the country. The game changed. Substitutions became unlimited in 1945, necessitating deeper rosters and freer rotations. Even Denver changed, booming in the wake of World War II. Eventually, Ambrose grew tired of politicking for no reward. In 1947, he stepped away from the club, and with him went the All-Americans McCracken, Grunig, and Bob Marsh to form the appropriately named Denver Graybeards. They were the 4th AAU basketball team in Denver, a city that, while growing, had fewer than 400,000 residents. There was no world in which that model was sustainable. Emil Berkowitz, Ambrose's replacement as chairman of the Nuggets, knew that if somebody didn't make a drastic move, the competition would kill everyone. In fact, on a larger scale, it was killing everyone. Trying so hard to distinguish their on-court product from regular AAU basketball backed the ABL into a corner. There were significant doubts if they'd even be able to play in 47-48. Much less beyond that. Multiple teams were having professionalism scandals, cross-country airfare was draining the teams dry, and a decrease in regional rivalries meant that it was harder to fill the seats. Really, the Nuggets found themselves with just 3 choices. They could shut up shop, an eventuality which they had spent the better part of 2 decades desperately trying to avoid. They could also follow their longtime rivals, the Phillips 66ers, to the National Industrial Basketball League, an upstart home for amateur basketball. Lacking an industrial sponsor, however, that seemed a poor cultural fit. Maybe, just maybe, they could instead exercise the nuclear option, turn their entire history as one of the nation's premier AAU teams on its head. Maybe they could turn pro. It wasn't an outrageous thought. Pro basketball salaries were finally catching up to those offered by full-time jobs, and the leagues were thereby starting to field genuine stars. George Mikan, Jim Pollard, and Bob Davies, the inventor of the behind-the-back dribble, all plied their trade in the professional game. There were no more McCrackens coming out to play AAU ball for the love of it. It was a different era, a different game, and Berkowitz didn't want to miss his shot, long as it may be, to keep basketball at the forefront of Denver's collective identity. By the fall of 1948, the Nuggets had announced that they were officially turning pro to join the National Basketball League. They may not have known it at the time, but it was a Hail Mary play for the NBL as much as it was for Denver. A bitter 3-year battle with the rival Basketball Association of America had seen the league repeatedly plundered for its teams and payrolls run up in massive bidding wars. At the end of the 47-48 season, the BAA made off with Mikan's Lakers, the Fort Wayne Pistons, the Rochester Royals, and the Indianapolis Jets, 3 of whom still exist today, leaving the league with little in the way of talent. Each team they had added for 48-49, Denver, Detroit, Hammond, and Waterloo, was in a final frontier of amateurism, meant to wring every last drop from the AAU's player pool just to keep the on-court product above water. Though they couldn't convince McCracken, who failed to see the honor in professional sport, 7 of Denver's 10 regular players did come from the regional collegiate or AAU scene as intended. Even the big Ace Grunig, 35 years old at the opener, signed up for one last dance. It was not destined to be the send-off he sought, however. Professional basketball had not only caught the amateur game, it had far, far surpassed it, and there was little the aging superstar could do to carry his team as he had in the days of old. Helpless to withstand the coming onslaught, the 4 amateur teams who joined the NBL finished with the 4 worst records. Detroit was so bad that they went out of business after playing just 19 of their 64 scheduled games. Still, the league stuck to the plan. Since the end of the 1948 Olympics, NBL Vice President Leo Ferris had been eyeing a coup for the biggest amateur stars left out there. Kentucky center Alex Groza, leading scorer for the U.S., and 5 of his collegiate teammates had been part of the Americans' gold-winning effort in London. Ferris couldn't believe the level at which they played. In his eyes, Adolph Rupp's high-octane collegians were potential crown jewels of professional basketball, even more so after winning their 2nd consecutive tournament title in '49. They were not mere prospects to be pontificated on in smoke-filled film rooms, Ferris thought. They could be a secret weapon that would preserve forever the NBL spot at the top of the professional basketball hierarchy. All he had to do was get them in the door. It took a gargantuan effort to convince the Wildcats to eschew the growing BAA and take part in the floundering NBL. Ferris agreed to place every man on the same roster in a nearby city on a brand new team that they would collectively own. Did it reek of desperation? Absolutely. Did it work? You bet. For the first time, the NBL had struck back, placing a higher-profile team in a BAA market to siphon away their attendance and their cash. The BAA, having spent years in the red trying to put the NBL out of business, couldn't withstand such an impact. BAA Commissioner Maurice Podoloff had no choice but to come to the table and hash out some kind of understanding with Ferris. Kill or be killed was over. It was time for making peace and making it to the other side. The only problem was, neither Ferris or Podoloff knew what that would look like. Baseball had 2 separate leagues that operated in a rigid alliance with one another. Football had one league formed from many of the best regional teams in the 20s, and they had gone a half step wayward to walk either of those paths. They would have to blaze their own trail, taking inspiration anywhere they could find it. Ultimately, they found it in a surprisingly likely place. Many of the BAA's owners only began fielding basketball teams to fill the calendar for their hockey arenas, which sat dormant far too often to be profitable. Only 2 decades prior, those hockey teams had monopolized control over the sport by poaching all the best talent from financially unstable leagues to their teams in big and devoted markets. That model was one they had experience with and could follow, albeit one that would take significant compromise. The new league would keep every team that was still viable, all 17 extant NBL and BAA organizations and the expansion Olympians, regardless of location. It was the only way assured to get the men on board. Market sizes and practicality could be reckoned with later. Ferris and Podoloff also agreed to a joint leadership structure, where Podoloff would retain his title as commissioner while NBL president Ike Duffy would come on as chairman. Needing only a name, the 2 were combined as a representation of their shared vision, officially giving birth to the NBA. The Nuggets were equally overjoyed and panicked at the thought of playing in the new Super League. While the prospect of playing in MSG in the Boston Garden was tantalizing, they were woefully unprepared for their maiden voyage in the NBL, much less a more competitive league of greater quality. Management swept out nearly the entire franchise. Only Jimmy Darden, Al Guokas, and Jack Cotton remained. In doing so, they also retired their identity as the team of the Rockies. They only brought on or retained 4 former Skyline Conference stars in the rebuild, a group which had traditionally represented an overwhelming majority of the team. They didn't even consider players over 30, as the Grunig-centric old guard strategy had nearly sunk the now decades-old operation so badly that they had to take the company public. It was a total turning of the page. The team was unrecognizable. Not long after, the league was unrecognizable too. Before a ball was tipped, Oshkosh dropped out of the league, finding that they were unable to meet the increased financial obligations in such a small city. The entire league had to redraw their schedules. The NBA was originally meant to be 3 divisions of 6 teams, a nice even number that made schedules simple and predictable. Instead, it had to be a hastily thrown together mess. It also allowed Podoloff and the BAA teams to install a fairly rigid hierarchy favoring their own interest. Oshkosh cast aside, Syracuse represented the only team joining from the NBL that wasn't in the Western Division, and the only one the BAA actually wanted anyway. Under the guise of trying to balance the schedule, they were able to effectively segregate everyone else. The Central and Eastern teams played 6 games against each other, while the West only played them twice, monopolizing the league's historic venues and biggest stages. The NBL team's only recourse against this blatant power grab was to come out and justify their continued existence by playing good basketball. The Nuggets struggled with that directive. Similar to the season before, a series of systemic setbacks and poor management decisions handicapped them beyond belief. They were almost 1,000 miles away from their nearest competitor. That kind of relative travel burden was going to ask a lot of the team, so they were going to need an overwhelming advantage of talent or will, and they had neither. Blessed for the first time with access to the East Coast market, the Nuggets were doing little to prove that their dominance of AAU basketball for so long had not been a fluke. They finished the season at 11-51, 8 games worse than any other team in the league, despite playing the next 2 worst teams 14 times. It was so paltry a performance that the team couldn't fill the smaller 5,200-seat DU arena, only drawing crowds between 2,000 and 3,000 with any regularity. GM Hal Davis even had to take the team on the road the final month of the season to try to break even. The year was nigh cataclysmic, an unmitigated disaster. Little did they know, their misery was only just beginning. As soon as the season ended, the Milwaukee Journal ran a sensational story saying that Podoloff and the BAA teams were looking to contract the league's smaller markets. This came right on the heels of the league office demanding a $50,000 bond from each team to prove their financial security. On the balance of the evidence, they were in big trouble, but Podoloff was quick to deny that any final decisions had been made, and Davis assured the media that he wouldn't go down without a fight. A fight was coming, too. Podoloff made it crystal clear in his denial that a decision was looming, that the league would play with no more than 14 teams, and Denver was vulnerable due to its geographic isolation. Over the next month, Davis managed to close the gap on the field, convincing several owners, especially those of the Indianapolis Olympians, that Denver was much more attractive than Sheboygan or Waterloo, and belonged in the so-called Ideal 14. But basketball wasn't a democracy. New York Knicks president Ned Irish, the league's most powerful owner and the so-called father of big-time basketball, refused to allow the Nuggets to disgrace his beloved Madison Square Garden. He didn't like small market teams, and he didn't like long-distance travel. The Nuggets were the worst of both worlds. In his eyes, small-timers like them, with modest crowds, meager revenues, and disproportionate financial obligations, were going to sink the league. He knew that he could force everyone to see his way too. As he had several times to this point, all Irish had to do was threaten to withdraw the Knicks, or more aptly Madison Square Garden, from the league, and the NBA would fall in line. So he did. Rather than the 14 Podoloff initially sought, the NBA was trimmed to 11 teams. The BAA owners cleaned house. To further rub salt in the wound, the NBA raided all of their rosters, despite promising not to interfere in a potential new league, leaving the teams devoid of what little talent they had. Faced with basketball dying for good in Denver, the organization had to try something, anything. Free from the branding shackles of the NBA, they found a sponsor, Frontier Refining, who could close some of their budget shortfall and kickstart a push for the new National Professional Basketball League. But interest in the game had died. Denver basketball fans, accustomed to championships and Hall of Fame players, had become disillusioned with the product on offer. After 20 years of that high, they were not going to be subjected to second-rate basketball in a second-rate league. It just wasn't going to happen. By February, the team decided it had no choice but to abandon the city, and so closed the most illustrious chapter of Denver's basketball history. It would be nearly 20 years more until the ABA's Denver Rockets brought high-level basketball back to the Mile High City. Some original Nuggets, like general manager Vince Barilla, were even involved in the project. It was a fitting resolution, I suppose. As they had laid the groundwork in the grand scheme, they were entrusted with doing the same on Denver's return to the sport. It wasn't long before they got their name back, before Skywalker Thompson and Larry Brown brought some of their identity back, before they got their championship habit back. It hasn't always been sunshine and roses along the way, but Denver's place at basketball's adult table is now certain, and without doubt, it owes that to Ambrose and Darden, to Grunig and McCracken, even to James Naismith himself.